Armageddon. The apocalypse. The end of the world. Predicted thousands of times, but in 1200 BC it actually happened, and no one saw it coming. Some of the greatest civilizations of the age were wiped out in a single generation.
In ancient civilizations from the 2nd and 3rd millennia BC, it is the Egyptians who occupy the limelight for their dazzling sculpture and art, the hieroglyphics they left behind, the royal tombs, and the incredible architecture, including, of course, the pyramids. In the Egypt of those times, merchants traded exquisitely beautiful vases, now known as chimeras. It was said they came from an island in the middle of the Mediterranean, a rich, sweet, and peaceful island, a paradise. The description enticed many Egyptians who wanted to visit. Travelers would change boats in various ports as they moved up the coasts of Lebanon, Cyprus, and the islands of the southern Aegean. One of the first remarkable sights they would encounter was Mount Ida, 8,058 feet high, in the middle of the island of Crete. In the 2nd millennium BC, Crete was the center of a vast domain that encompassed most of the islands in the Aegean. For this reason, the Minoan civilization, named after Minos, the legendary king of Crete, was also called the Aegean civilization. The Minoans lived in a rich and verdant land. In Crete, abundant water flowed down from Mount Ida to irrigate the fields. They were surrounded and defended by the sea, which they sailed as the uncontested masters. They lived in a society without conflicts. And yet, their civilization suddenly disappeared. Archaeologists wondered how a civilization that had left such significant and impressive traces could have come to ruin so quickly and mysteriously.
The real sort of typical home of the kinds of things we're talking about is Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, spreading out beyond Iraq and going up into Syria and neighboring places. It, too, was very similar to the civilization, apparently a little bit newer, in the Nile Valley in Egypt, about which we know a great deal more than we know about the Minoans, because, as you know, in the 19th century, scholars discovered how to read the languages that were written in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, and are able to develop something approaching history for the period we're talking about. That is not true for Crete, because although they had a script, and we have available to us tablets with those writings on them, to this day, no one has deciphered the language written by the Minoans, and therefore we don't have that kind of knowledge. In the 19th century, there was a lot of talk about races. There were people who spoke about the Greek race or similar races for quite a long time. In the science of anthropology and subjects like that, it's been determined that those terms are inappropriate. They suggest there's something in the genes that explain the characteristics of a particular people. That is certainly not true. So let's understand each other. We're talking about a culture. Let's take Mycenae, which is maybe the best example of the whole culture. Certainly, it's a perfect model for what we're talking about. What you have to begin with is a town or a city or a settlement of some kind built on top of a hill. And it's usually intended to be a formidable hill, one not easily accessible to anybody who comes walking along. A place, in other words, that would make a very nice fort, a citadel. And that's indeed what we find at Mycenae. And on that citadel, on that strongly rocky fort or citadel, they built what we now identify as the royal palace, the palace of the king. And that was, I should point out, maybe about 10 miles from the sea. Now, not all Mycenaean sites are so far from the sea. Some of them are closer. But what it's important to say is that none of them are right on the sea. They're always back some few miles. The reason for that, I think, is that the early times in which these civilizations arose saw all kinds of dangers coming, and the swiftest, the least suspected, the one that could come upon you overnight, came from the sea. Here we're talking about a wealthy civilization, at least in which the rulers are wealthy, and in which the rulers, of course, are very powerful. These cultures engaged in trade to a significant degree. You find Mycenaean elements, tools, other things, pottery particularly, of a certain kind, all over the Mediterranean Sea. You find it in datable places, and that's why we can give this some kind of date, such as in Egypt. The Mycenaeans had a regular trade with Egypt. You find Egyptian things in Mycenae and vice versa. And also, presumably, much of it must have gone into Mesopotamia. Some of it went all the way to the Western Mediterranean. This was a civilization that was not shut in on itself, but was in touch with the entire Mediterranean region. Over the entire Aegean Sea, and indeed across the Mediterranean, in the years of the Mycenaean period, roughly from 1600 to 1100 or so BC, you are dealing with a largely unified culture. What is it? What do we talk about the world like these days? What's the cliche? Globalized world. It was a globalized world, except it was a little piece of the globe.
This is the late Bronze Age, and actually the Bronze Age goes from 3000 to 1000 BC, give or take. And we're in that last part of it. The way you make bronze, as I put up here, is tin and copper, right? 90% copper, 10% tin. Most of the copper is used to make bronze at that time. The copper is not a problem. It's coming from Cyprus. In fact, that's where the word comes from. Kypros, Cyprus, means copper. The tin is a little bit more problematic. Possible some came from Cornwall, though I rather doubt they got up there more than once in a blue moon. There are some tin mines in southern Turkey, but not enough. The vast majority came from Afghanistan. So you can see that you've got a trade route of hundreds, if not thousands of miles. If you cut it at any point, you are indeed in trouble. And in fact, a colleague of mine in England has said that for them, tin was like oil is for us, right? And that keeping the steady flow of tin is the same problem that we've got for oil. And I think that's a pretty good analogy. So we've got this globalized society, trade, reciprocity, diplomacy. Everybody's marrying each other's daughters for gold and silver and whatnot. And then into it, you drop a little chaos, and suddenly we've got a big, big problem. They lose the art of writing. They lose the art of large buildings. You get a dark age, right? So Mycenaean civilization is considered to end just after 1200. Same with Minoans. Same with Hittites. Same with Assyrians. Same with Babylonia.
And then we see that when this culture comes to an end, it is accompanied by people fleeing, getting away from the Mycenaean world. Some of them go only so far as Athens, which had the good fortune somehow of not being destroyed. One of the few important Mycenaean places that is not destroyed. So for some reason it was safe in Athens, and some fled to Athens. Others had to keep going and settled on the islands of the Aegean Sea. For others, it was necessary to go further and to settle the west coast of Asia Minor, which indeed this is the great period of Greek settlement on the west coast of Asia Minor. And then it looks like there came a moment where there was a final blow, where whatever was attempting to overthrow these cities and this civilization succeeded. Not the same in every place. The fall of Pylos is generally thought to be around 1200 BC. Mycenae itself, maybe 50 years later, and other places later than that. I think it's very important to notice that some of these places that were big in the Mycenaean world were entirely abandoned and not settled again by the Greeks. Buried, lost. People didn't even know where they were. That's extraordinary. That only happens when something very, very large drives people away from an inhabited site.
We get a dark age that lasts for between 150 and 300 years, and basically civilization has to reboot in this area. Only the Egyptians survive because they win, but it's a Pyrrhic victory. They are never as strong again. That was their high point, the New Kingdom period. This was a huge loss to the world. It is comparable to the collapse of the Roman Empire, which happened 1,500 years later. The main problem is we're not really sure what caused it. It used to be that it was a very simple explanation. The simple solution was that the Sea Peoples had done it. When in doubt, the Sea Peoples. So, who are the Sea Peoples? Well, this is the Egyptian name for them. The Egyptians, actually, it's our name for them. We call them the Sea Peoples. The Egyptians talk about a number of different groups coming through the Eastern Mediterranean and winding up in Egypt on the shores, attacking them, not once but twice over a 30-year period. They come in 1207 and they come in 1177. The Egyptians tell us in both reigns, in Merneptah and Ramses III, but let me focus on Ramses III here because it's more literally picturesque. He gives us a picture of the invasion and an inscription of what went on. So he tells us the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in their fray. No land could stand before their arms. And then he tells us what happens, who they overran. From Hate, Kode, Carchemish, Artsua, and Elashia on. Now we know where these places are. Hati is Turkey, it's the Hittites. Kode is where Turkey meets Syria. Carchemish, northern Syria. Artsua is actually western Turkey on the coast there. Elashia is the ancient name for Cyprus. So these people are sweeping across from west to east, across Turkey, down the Levant, across Cyprus. They set up a camp in Amur, that's northern Syria. Desolated its people, its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt. Flame was prepared before them. And then he actually tells us the name of the peoples. He says their confederation was the Peleset, the Tejeker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. So he gives us, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right there. There's another 6 that are mentioned the first time back in 1207. 2 of them overlap, so there's a total of 9 separate groups that come twice in those 30 years. So, where are they from? What are they doing? What happens to them? Well, we're told part of that. Ramses, in another inscription from a couple years later, he says, I overthrew those who invaded from their lands. I slew the Denyen, who were in their isles. The Tejeker and the Peleset were made ashes. The Shardana and the Weshesh of the sea, they were made as those that exist not. So he beats them. And in fact, Merneptah had beaten them back in 1207 as well. So they come twice, they lose twice, they do not come a third time. That's it. What I would like to do then is to figure out, if it's not the Sea Peoples, then what else could have caused this? So, could it have been drought, like some have suggested? Could it have been famine? Could it have been invaders? Could it have been earthquakes? And my answer to this is yes. I actually think it's all of them. Because you can survive a famine, or at least some people can. You can survive a drought. You can survive invaders. You could survive an earthquake. Yes, lots of people will die, but your civilization does not end. What if you have more than one of them then? if you have a multiplier effect, if you have what I would call a perfect storm. And that's what I think happens. What Ramses shows us is that these people that are coming, they're not like Vikings. They're not just raiding. They're bringing their families. You've got the wife, you've got the kids, you've got the belongings, you've got the ox cart. These are people moving. They're migrating.
What we find after the fall of the Mycenaean world in Greece are some of the following things that were not typically found in the Mycenaean world. First of all, iron weapons, not bronze ones. The building of buildings in the shape of what the Greeks called a megaron, a rectangular center which has a hearth in it, a front porch, and a back porch, which will be the style in which Greek temples are built in the historical period. That appears for the first time after the fall of the Mycenaeans. We know that the Mycenaeans buried their dead by inhumation, those great tombs, those great grave things, and even the common people outside them are buried in graves. Whereas in the historical period, these people were cremated. One of the sea peoples that attacked the Nile in around 1200 in Egypt are called the Peleset, and most scholars suggest that that is the same name as came to be the name for this region when they ruled it, called Palestine. And you will remember that when the Bible talks about this, it refers to a people called the Philistines. These are thought to be all the same people.
Are we facing a situation that is similar today? Is there climate change? Well, we could argue all night about that, right? But let's say for argument, yes, at least some. Are there famines and droughts in the world today? Yes, of course there are. Earthquakes? Yes. Rebellions? Yes. I think the only thing that's missing are sea peoples.